Hello, and thanks for joining me. In recent days, I've been thinking a lot about the RMS Titanic. It's something that's always fascinated me. I've watched both big films, by which I mean the best two known films, of course, the James Cameron 1997 version, and just tonight, the 1958 A Night to Remember. So the Titanic's been on my mind a lot of late. No particular reason, just that we've just passed the 105th anniversary, and I just happen to have been thinking about it a lot. But what I want to do in this video, I'm going to make more Titanic videos in the days to come, covering a number of different issues, a number of different intrigues around the Titanic. But what I want to do in this video is cover other major maritime disasters that are not as well known, but some of which actually surpass the Titanic in terms of fatalities. So they're worth talking about a little bit. So the first obvious thing to look at is why is the Titanic so much better known than all these other disasters? I think it's fair to say that we use the Titanic as a template almost on which to measure every other maritime disaster against. So it's no coincidence that when the Costa Concordia incident happened in 2012, there were inevitable comparisons. Both the Titanic and the Costa Concordia were luxury liners. Um, both were large liners. The Costa Concordia was over twice the size of the Titanic in terms of tonnage. Um, and also, there was that uncanny fact that the Costa Concordia occurred almost 100 years exactly after the Titanic. Yeah, only 32 people died in the Costa Concordia by comparison, but there were comparisons in terms of the perceived negligence of both disasters. And I think it's fair to say that the Costa Concordia was the largest ship ever to be abandoned of any kind, including military vessels. I think that may be I may be it may be the reason why it's garnered quite a lot of attention. Um, Looking back to 2002, there was a disaster that has become known as Africa's Titanic, but it's nowhere near as well known as the Titanic, and that is MV Lejula. This was a vessel traveling between Senegal and two ports in Senegal, and it was very overcrowded. If you look at the vessel, there's a photograph of it from 1991. It wasn't actually a huge vessel, but it was hugely overcrowded. Over 2,000 people on board, and an incredible 1,864 people perished in sinking in rough seas on the 26th of September 2002. Um, this is made all the worse by the fact that it was clearly a case of negligence that this ferry was overcrowded. Had major political fallouts for the Senegalese government, and to this day it is a very taboo subject in that country. But it's dubbed Africa's Titanic because it's Africa's worst ever maritime disaster. 1,864 perished. To put that in context, deaths on the Titanic were 1,514. Some figures put that slightly higher, some slightly lower, but about 1,514. So with MV Lejula, we're talking about 300 more people perished. So it was a truly devastating disaster. Now, that isn't even the only disaster that surpasses the Titanic among peacetime disasters. And I should emphasize in this, I'm going to be reading peacetime is a very subjective term, and I'll come back to that. 1987, 30 years ago, the Donna Paz, and I'm reading from Wikipedia here. On the 20th of December 1987, the ferry bound for Manila, with more than its capacity of unlisted passengers, collided with the oil tanker MT Vector in the Tablas Strait near Marinduque. The resultant fire and sinking left an estimated 4,386 dead, which included all but 24 of Donna Paz's passengers and all but two of Vector's 13-man crew. As I understand it, there has been a Seconds from Disaster documentary on this, among a number of other documentaries, but still relatively all known outside the Philippines. but truly a horrendous disaster. Over 4,000 lives lost 30 years ago. That would appear to be the world's worst ever peacetime disaster. Um, Now, 1948, and this is why I mentioned subjective. The passenger steamship packed beyond its capacity limit with refugees fleeing the People's Liberation Army, blew up and sank in the mouth of the Huangpu River, 80 kilometers south of Shanghai on the 4th of December 1948. The suspected cause of the explosion was a Qianya hitting a mine left by the Imperial Japanese Navy in World War II. So 1948, this was 3 years after World War II. The exact death toll is unknown, however. It is thought that between 2,750 and 3,920 people perished, with 700 to 1,000 survivors. So let's make a figure of about 3,200. That would make that the second worst disaster. Now, this is where the controversy lies. Should that be classed as a peacetime disaster? I'm not so sure. 1948 was still in the midst of the Chinese Civil War, and these were refugees fleeing the PLA, so presumably on the Kuomintang side of the conflict. Um, I'm not sure if that should be classed as a peacetime disaster because it was technically in wartime, not World War II, not World War One, but technically in wartime. So that would be subjective whether that is classed as a peacetime disaster or not. Another better known incident is 1917, the infamous Halifax explosion, which I think I'm right in saying remains the largest um, explosion, non-nuclear explosion in history, accidental non-nuclear explosion. Obviously, I'm not including Trump's recent dropping of the mother of all bombs, so-called, in Afghanistan. The Halifax explosion, up to 2,000 people may have perished when the Mont Blanc collided in Nova Scotia, Canada. The Mont Blanc collided with the Norwegian ship Imo in the narrowest part of the Halifax harbour. This was a massive explosion, could be felt miles away. 2,000 people perished. Um, the Titanic. Now, the Titanic actually ranks, if we look at those disasters, if we consider the Donna Paz and the MV the Jola to be peacetime disasters, then the Titanic would rank third. Titanic is still a major disaster, there's no question about it. It's not just famous, it still ranks as one of the worst maritime disasters in terms of lives lost, but certainly by no means the only one. 1949, Taiping. On January the 27th, 1949, the Chinese steamer Taiping sank after a collision with another vessel en route to Taiwan, leading to the deaths of over 1,500 people. So we're talking here a disaster about the same scale as the Titanic. But again, this was in the midst of the Chinese Civil War and included refugees fleeing from Shanghai to Keelung, which is present day Taiwan, 1949. One of the worst of recent years, 1991, Saudi Arabia, the Salem Express. This sank on a voyage from Jeddah to Safaga in Egypt with more than 1,600 passengers on board. It struck a reef. The official toll is 470, but most accounts suggest the actual toll is 1,400. It's at relatively shallow depth, so the wreck can still be seen. And just going through some other disasters, the Toya Maru was a Japanese passenger ferry that sank in Typhoon Marie in the Sugara Strait between the Japanese islands of Hokkaido and Honshu, on the 26th of September 1954. It is said that some 1,153 people perished. 1914, the RMS Empress of Ireland, 29th of May 1914, the passenger liner sank after colliding with the cargo ship Storstad on the St. Lawrence River in Canada, killing 1,012 people. That remains the worst disaster on Canadian waters. Now, one of the most interesting I find was a disaster that actually occurred the same year as the Titanic, and only a few months later, the Keech Maru sank in a typhoon in the Pacific, 27th of September 1912. It is estimated that more than 1,000 people perished. Now, the reason it was, I guess, lost in the international attention is the Titanic was still making headlines at this point. And also, it was the death toll from the Keech Maru was included in the overall death toll of that typhoon season. So that's, I guess, why it kind of got overshadowed by the Titanic, even though itself was a pretty large scale disaster. Um, the Hong Mo. On the 3rd of March 1921, the Hong Mo struck the White Rocks on Lamok Island near Swato, now Shantou, which is a major port city in the south of China. She broke into and sank, killing about 1,000 of the 1,100 people on board, and this was a Singapore registered vessel. 1996, the Bacoba. The overloaded ferry sank on the 21st of May 1996 in Lake Victoria. While the ship's manifest showed 443 on board, it is estimated that about 800 people died in the sinking. Now, if we look at recent years, there's been a number of big disasters. The Al Salam Bacasio 98. I remember this disaster, I remember reading about it. The 3rd of February 2006. The roll-on, roll-off passenger ferry Al Salam Bacasio 98 sank in the Red Sea en route from Duba, Saudi Arabia, to Safaga in southern Egypt. The ferry was carrying 1,312 passengers and 96 crew. Only 388 people survived, about 1,020 perished. This looks to be the same route as that earlier 1991 disaster, um, the the Salam Express. So Lal Salam Bacasio 98 and the Salam Express, very similar disasters. Looking back to more recent years, um, we look at the Princess of the Stars 2008 in the Philippines. Some 690 people perished. Again, that was part of Typhoon Fengshen, and it sank off the San Fernando coast in Romblon. Bangladesh 2003, the Nazarene 1 disaster. 530 people perished in the Meghna River. The Eastern Star, China, 2015. On the 1st of June 2015, the Chinese river cruise ship Eastern Star capsized on an overnight voyage after being hit by a tornadic waterspout during severe weather while in the Damajo waterway section of the Yangtze River in Hubei province. 452 people perished. And I remember there was a lot of censorship around that disaster, which caused a great deal of controversy. Um, Looking at one of the most recent big disasters, the seawall in South Korea, of course, that got quite a lot of attention because a lot of the victims were young students. 304 people perished. There was a lot of criminal charges made against the captain and crew for negligence. Very notorious disaster. And there has been many, many others. I haven't even mentioned all those disasters in the Mediterranean with the migrant crisis. Again, though, this is subjective whether you count that as peacetime or not, because if many of them are refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war, that would technically be a wartime disaster. One of the worst of all those disasters occurred in April 2015, when in one incident as many as 900 people may have perished, which makes that the worst single maritime disaster of the 2010s. And is simply known as the Mediterranean Sea migrant shipwreck of the 19th of April 2015, only a week before 400 people have died. In this disaster, just off the island of Lampedusa, between 8 and 900 people perished. That is certainly the worst of this decade. So we'll leave it there. That's just peacetime disasters. During World War II, many, many vessels were sunk. The worst disasters seem to all be German and Japanese vessels. The very worst, the Wilhelm Gustloff, that was carrying both troops and refugees, sank by a Soviet submarine. As many as 9,000 people may have perished, which makes it by far the worst maritime disaster in history. But there were many other disasters, and I may make a separate video about that. Um, there was at least 30 World War II sinkings that had a toll worse than the Titanic, or at least on the sort of scale of the Titanic. So if we do use that 1912 Titanic disaster as a template, it's interesting to compare it and contrast. I think the reason the Titanic gets so much attention is because it was so much more than a ship. It was a representative of ideals. It was a representative of man's ingenuity, of man's arrogance, of luxury, of social divisions, of so many things. It was so symbolic, and I don't think interest will ever go. Um, there were many disasters in both world wars. The Lusitania, of course, was one of the best known, and it was a similar sort of liner to the Titanic. Okay, I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts. Um, it is certainly an interesting list, but if we look at all the disasters, I've only covered the 20th and 21st centuries. I haven't even looked at disasters before that. Certainly, Britain has, our waters are full of shipwrecks, some on a pretty large scale. One of the worst incidents in British maritime history, 1703, the great storm of that year, as many as 8,000 people may have perished, many of them Royal Navy ship hands, many of them small fishing boat sailors. Certainly, it's obvious that some of the worst disasters take place in Bangladesh and the Philippines, both countries with a very strong, and Indonesia, with very busy shipping routes. So I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts.